Professor Kagwanja. Well, he's the CEO and president of the Africa Policy Institute, to talk to us about how African countries can come together to cushion themselves against the steep U.S. tariffs. Now, Prof, I certainly hope that you can hear me clearly. You're just taking us through how we should interpret the imposition of these U.S. tariffs, whether they are merely trade penalties or whether they reflect a deeper recalibration of how the global north intends to relate to Africa economically. But with certain sectors like critical minerals, the pharmaceuticals and semiconductors exempted, do you see signs of strategic cherry picking by the United States that sort of reflects its own supply chain priorities rather than any genuine trade partnership ethos?
Yes, of course, the U.S. has taken an unilateral move, exited existing global framework of negotiating trade, but instead they want to flex its muscle against all the countries in the world, and particularly the weaker one. Therefore, it is using a heavy stake and a divide and rule strategy to renegotiate its relationship with the different countries across the world. And for me, this is an opportunity for Africa basically to reassert itself at different points. One, we have the lowest percentage of global trade, and which is estimated at 3%. I think this is a time to expand our trade with other countries in the global south. We need to seriously consider a global south strategy that deepens our relationship with Brazil, with India, with China, with the young tigers in the Asian tigers, and that will enable us to expand our share of the global trade. Second, we need to deepen trade within ourselves as Africans. We have the lowest trade linkages, even within countries, between countries, and across African regions. We have already set the Africa continental free trade area, and we need basically to deepen that whole network of 54 countries, which is perhaps the largest market by countries across the world. So we need now to actively implement our own frameworks that are supporting trade. Obviously, we need to explore strategically those markets that we can capture in the north, in the global north, particularly in the European Union. We can explore Eastern Europe. And even in the United States, we look at what gives us comparative advantage so that we deepen trade in the United States from a point of strength, our own strength as a people. That way, we are going to benefit more from the tariffs than keep on moaning and basically complaining when America is looking at its own interests. We should also look at our own interests.
I'm actually glad you touched on the AFTA, and it raises the question whether these global trade frictions present a realistic opportunity to turbocharge the African continental free trade area, or are we still too fragmented in infrastructure, in regulation, or even political will to absorb the displaced goods and investments locally?
Well, one thing we must underline here is that the North is, or America is imposing tariffs when the North itself is on the decline. For example, 67% of all investments are not coming from the North, they are coming from the South. When you look at the share of global GDP, now it is way above 46%. And therefore, the tariffs are not a kind of a death sentence to the economies of the South. In fact, it's a wake-up call, as I said earlier, for us to start thinking about our own potential, our own abilities, our own comparative advantage in a global economy. And that way, we are going to turn what looks like a doom into a boom. And I think that is when Africa is going to implement its own local frameworks. Also, the North needs Africa more than Africa needs the North.
Yeah.
As long as we can stay the course for the time being, they need our minerals, they need our agricultural products, they need our tea on their breakfast tables, they need our wheat, they need everything from us. So it is simply turning which seems our weakness now into our strength. It is a tall order, but it's something that we can do.
Certainly is a tall order. But in your view, Prof, which African sectors are best positioned to benefit if the continent redirects trade flows inwards? So again, I ask this question on intra-African demand, whether it can realistically offset the loss of high-value Western markets, particularly for countries like South Africa.
Yeah, well, countries will differ in terms of how they are going to be affected. South Africa is very closely fused with Western economies, but the rest of Africa is not.
Yeah.
And South Africa would do better by looking into Africa. This is one time that South Africa has basically to look north and begin to see opportunities in the other 53 countries, which are themselves growing. If you look at the Egyptian economy, look at the Ethiopian economy, look at the Nigerian economy, look at the Kenyan economy. When you look at all these economies collectively, and South Africa take a more pointed, policy towards deepening markets in those countries, I think it stands to gain long term, and it will not be vulnerable to nationalisms and isolationism.
Yeah, you just made a suggestion that we should be inward looking, but then how can we ensure that intra-Africa trade is not just elite level rhetoric, but something that tangibly reaches producers, the SMEs on the ground, and informal traders, and the rural economy?
For the rest of us, I think a trade regime that is driven by the people themselves is working.
Yes.
If you look at the number of Africans traveling to Southeast Asia, Africans traveling to other African countries, Africans traveling to Eastern Europe for trade, the numbers are growing. The West is the one that put barriers because of visas and all. But for those countries that have opened their doors, like in the Middle East, Africa is doing a human trade, not only in commodities, but even in basically marketing labor into those countries. So I don't think we need to see this dark cloud as having a never-growing silver lining in it. And I can see that silver lining.
All right, Prof, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for your analysis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, Professor Peter Kagwanja is the president and CEO of the Africa Policy Institute, designed to explore the intersection of global trade tensions, the intra-African trade potential, and of course the geopolitical agency of African nations in response to the US imposed 30% reciprocal tariffs on South African exports.